The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, crimson wine spreading like blood across Richard Sterling's $8,000 Armani tuxedo as 400 of Atlanta's elite froze mid-conversation. Grace Washington stood motionless, her trembling hands still gripping the empty silver tray, her server's uniform a stark contrast against the opulent ballroom where she'd once commanded standing ovations. This wasn't supposed to happen, not tonight, not when she had 6 months left to live. Gasps rippled through the crowd like dominoes falling, champagne glasses clinking as hands flew to mouths, the symphony orchestra's waltz dying into stunned silence. Eleanor Vanderburg's diamond necklace caught the light as she leaned forward, recognizing something achingly familiar in Grace's dignified posture despite the humiliation. Her 8-year-old daughter Zara peeked through the kitchen door, leg braces glinting, watching her mother's world collapse again, just like that terrible night 4 years ago when Daddy never came home. "Security!" Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Who was this woman who moved with the grace of a prima ballerina while wearing the uniform of the invisible? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Peachtree Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glittered like a constellation fallen to earth, its crystal chandeliers casting prismatic rainbows across the faces of Atlanta's most powerful elite. December's chill pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the warmth of privilege and philanthropy created its own climate. The Sterling Foundation's annual gala drew 400 guests at $1,000 per plate, each one a titan of industry, politics, or old Southern money. Tonight's cause: funding arts education for underprivileged children, a cruel irony that would soon become apparent. Grace Washington moved through the crowd like a ghost, her black server's uniform rendering her invisible among the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. At 34, she carried herself with an unconscious elegance that her weathered hands and tired eyes couldn't quite conceal. The uniform hung loose on her frame. Chemotherapy had stolen 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. Her dark hair, once thick and lustrous, was now carefully arranged to hide the thinning spots where treatment had taken its toll. But her posture remained straight, a remnant of years when she commanded stages rather than cleared tables. In the kitchen, 8-year-old Zara Washington pressed her face against the circular window of the service door, her leg braces catching the fluorescent light. The accident 4 years ago had taken her father and left her with mild cerebral palsy, but her spirit remained unbroken. She watched her mother with the intense focus of a child who understood that everything they had depended on these silent, graceful movements between tables. "Mama dances even when she's working," she whispered to the pastry chef, who'd become her unofficial babysitter during Grace's double shifts. Richard Sterling III surveyed his kingdom from the elevated head table, his steel blue eyes missing nothing. At 46, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that money could buy and power could sharpen. His Armani tuxedo fit like liquid shadow. His Patek Philippe watch caught the light with each gesture, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. The Sterling Foundation was his public face of benevolence, a tax write-off wrapped in genuine good intentions. But tonight, something felt different. The weight of expectations pressed against his chest like a stone, and the familiar ache of loneliness gnawed at the edges of his carefully constructed facade. Across the room, Eleanor Vanderburg sat in solitary splendor, her diamond necklace worth more than most people's houses. At 78, she was Atlanta royalty, old money, older grief, and the kind of refined loneliness that comes from a lifetime of choosing security over dreams. Her mansion in Buckhead echoed with 40 years of silence since her husband's death, 12 bedrooms that had never heard children's laughter. Tonight, like every night, she wore her jewels like armor, against the crushing weight of a life unlived. Dr. Harrison Cole occupied his wheelchair with the dignity of a man who'd spent 8 decades fighting for respect in a world determined to deny it. The retired neurosurgeon had broken barriers in medicine when such victories came at tremendous personal cost. His weathered brown hands, once steady enough to operate on the human brain, now trembled slightly with age. But his mind remained sharp as surgical steel, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd witnessed both humanity's cruelty and its capacity for redemption. The evening had begun like any other gala night for Grace Washington. She'd arrived at the Peachtree Plaza at 5:30, 30 minutes before her shift started because punctuality was the armor of the invisible. The hotel service elevator carried her to the kitchen where she'd changed into her pressed black uniform, pinned her thinning hair into a neat bun, and swallowed 2 anti-nausea pills with lukewarm coffee. The chemotherapy session that morning had left her lightheaded, but the medical bills wouldn't pay themselves, and Zara's physical therapy cost $300 a week. "Grace, honey, you look pale," said Maria Gonzalez, the head server who'd become her closest friend among the staff. "You sure you're up for tonight? It's a big crowd." "I'm fine," Grace lied, the way she'd been lying for months. Nobody at work knew about the cancer. Nobody knew about the prognosis. 6 months, Dr. Patterson had said, maybe 8 if the new treatment protocol worked. But treatment cost money, and money meant working every shift she could manage. The ballroom buzzed with the energy of Atlanta's elite at their most performative. Grace had served these events for 3 years now, long enough to recognize the patterns. The oil executives clustered near the bar, their wives comparing vacation homes in Hilton Head. The tech entrepreneurs gravitated toward the younger crowd, their conversations peppered with valuations and exit strategies. The old money families held court at their reserved tables, their southern accents thick as honey and twice as deliberate. Grace moved between the tables with practiced invisibility, refilling water glasses and removing empty plates. Her movements retained the fluid grace of her dancing days, muscle memory that 20 years of training had carved into her bones. She'd learned to be grateful for her invisibility. It meant she could work without drawing attention, without questions, without pity. "Mama, you're floating again," Zara had told her just last week, watching Grace move around their tiny apartment, "like when you used to dance in the videos Daddy showed me." Those videos lived in a shoebox under Grace's bed now. Newspaper clippings from her days as principal dancer with the Atlanta Ballet Theater, programs from Lincoln Center, reviews that called her luminous and transcendent. Another lifetime when Grace Washington was a name that mattered, when she commanded stages instead of clearing them. The accident had changed everything in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus driving them home from a performance in Savannah, the drunk driver running the red light, the sound of metal tearing like the world itself was breaking apart. Marcus died on impact. Zara spent 2 months in the hospital, emerging with leg braces and a slight slur to her speech. Grace's injuries were internal. 3 shattered ribs, a punctured lung, and damage to her right hip that ended her dancing career as surely as if they'd amputated her legs. Now she balanced a tray of champagne flutes filled with Dom Perignon, each glass worth more than her daily wages. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had once been toasted with such champagne now served it to people who looked through her as if she were made of air. Her hands trembled slightly, a side effect of the medications, but she'd learned to compensate, to move more carefully, to never let the facade crack. Senator Bradley stood near the orchestra pit, gesticulating wildly as he told some story about his golf game to a circle of admiring donors. Grace approached from behind, intending to offer champagne to his group. She'd done this dance 1,000 times, approach discreetly, offer service with a smile, retreat before becoming an intrusion. So I told the caddy, "Son, I've been playing this game since before you were born." Senator Bradley threw back his head in laughter, taking a step backward to emphasize his point. Grace saw it happening as if in slow motion, his elbow connecting with her tray, the 5 crystal flutes lifting into the air like glittering birds, the cascade of champagne and broken glass that followed. The Dom Perignon hit Richard Sterling's pristine white shirt first, spreading across the fabric like a crimson stain of judgment. The crystal exploded against the marble floor with the sound of a gunshot, each shard catching the light like fallen stars. The ballroom fell silent as if someone had sucked all the air from the room. 400 faces turned toward them, 400 pairs of eyes that suddenly saw Grace Washington for the first time in 3 years. But not as she'd once been seen, not as an artist, not as a person of value, but as the walking embodiment of everything that could go wrong when the help forgot their place. Grace stood frozen in the center of the destruction, her empty tray clutched in hands that shook not from medication now, but from the terrible weight of being seen in her most vulnerable moment. The silence stretched like a bowstring, tight and dangerous, waiting for someone to release it and let the consequences fly. Richard Sterling's face transformed from surprise to cold fury in the span of a heartbeat. The champagne dripped from his starched white shirt like liquid humiliation, each drop a calculated insult to his carefully constructed image. His steel blue eyes locked onto Grace with the kind of predatory focus that had made him millions in real estate. The look of a man who crushed opposition before breakfast and forgot their names by lunch. "Jesus Christ!" His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Do you people not understand the basic concept of spatial awareness?" Grace dropped to her knees immediately, her muscle memory from 3 years of invisible service taking over. Her hands moved automatically to gather the crystal shards, each piece sharp enough to draw blood, each fragment worth more than her hourly wage. The champagne soaked through her black uniform, the expensive alcohol mixing with the scent of her fear-induced perspiration. Her hands trembled, not from the chemotherapy this time, but from the weight of 400 stares pressing down on her like physical force. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cruel silence. "I'll pay for the cleaning. I'll pay for everything." Richard's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Pay? On your salary?" He gestured broadly to his audience, playing to the crowd like a seasoned performer. "This jacket costs more than you make in 6 months. Hell, probably a year." The crowd shifted restlessly, some looking uncomfortable, others leaning forward with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a public execution. Phones began appearing discreetly, camera lenses catching the light like predatory eyes. This was the kind of scene that would light up social media: rich man versus poor server, privilege versus desperation, all played out in high definition for the world's entertainment. Eleanor Vanderberg watched from her table with growing horror. Something about Grace's posture, the way she held her spine straight even while kneeling, the careful dignity of her movements, struck a chord deep in Eleanor's memory. She'd seen that same Grace under pressure before, in another lifetime, in another woman who'd learned to carry herself like royalty even when the world treated her like a servant. "Richard, that's enough," Eleanor called out, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older grief. But her words were lost in the rising tide of Richard's performance. "You know what the problem is?" Richard continued, loosening his tie with theatrical precision. "No accountability. No consequences." He looked around the room, gathering support from his audience. "These people break your property, destroy your evening, and then expect sympathy because they mumble an apology." Senator Bradley, the man whose thoughtless gesture had caused the collision, stepped back into the shadows, letting the hired help take the blame for his clumsiness. The other servers around the room's periphery froze like deer sensing a predator, knowing that Grace's humiliation was a warning to all of them about the price of visibility. In the kitchen doorway, Zara pressed her small face against the circular window, her leg braces clinking softly against the metal door frame. At 8 years old, she possessed the terrible clarity that comes to children who've learned too young that the world can be cruel to those it considers disposable. She watched her mother, the woman who sang her to sleep with lullabies, who helped her with homework after 14-hour shifts, who danced around their tiny apartment on the rare mornings when the pain medications worked, reduced to gathering broken glass while grown-ups laughed. "Mama," Zara whispered to the empty kitchen behind her, her small voice breaking with the weight of understanding she was too young to carry. Dr. Harrison Cole gripped the armrests of his wheelchair until his knuckles went white. At 84, he'd seen enough cruelty to recognize the particular viciousness of public humiliation designed to reinforce social hierarchies. Something about the server's movements nagged at his memory, a familiar quality to her grace under pressure that he couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore. Richard walked to the orchestra pit, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble with the rhythm of approaching doom. The conductor, reading the room's energy, lowered his baton and waited. Richard gestured, and the opening notes of La Comparsita filled the ballroom, a tango as passionate and tragic as any Greek drama. Grace's head snapped up at the first notes, her dark eyes going wide with recognition and pain. This wasn't just any tango. It was the song she'd danced to at her wedding, the melody Marcus had hummed while teaching 3-year-old Zara to follow his steps around their living room, the soundtrack to a happiness so complete she'd never imagined it could be destroyed by a drunk driver and a moment's inattention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice carrying easily over the music, "I have a proposition for our talented employee here." The word talented dripped with sarcasm thick as honey. "Since she's so eager to serve, let's give her a chance to truly entertain us." The crowd stirred with anticipation, sensing blood in the water. Camera phones emerged more boldly now, no longer hiding their intent to capture whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Richard approached Grace, who remained kneeling among the crystal shards, her uniform stained dark with champagne and her dignity hanging by threads. He extended his hand toward her in a mockery of gallantry, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Here's my offer," he announced to the room. "If this woman can perform this tango, if she can dance with even basic competence, I'll marry her right here, right now." The explosion of laughter was immediate and cruel. 400 voices joined in a chorus of derision that echoed off the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. The sound washed over Grace like a physical blow, each laugh a small violence, each chuckle a reminder of her place in their world. "Imagine the headlines," Richard continued, feeding off the crowd's energy. "Sterling Foundation CEO weds clumsy server in champagne catastrophe." But even as the laughter reached its crescendo, something shifted in Grace's posture. She raised her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting Richard's pale ones with a directness that made him step back involuntarily. In that moment, the woman kneeling among broken crystal wasn't the invisible server who'd moved through their world for 3 years. She was someone else entirely, someone who'd once commanded different kinds of attention, different kinds of respect. "And when she makes a fool of herself," Richard added quickly, suddenly needing to reassert control over the narrative, "when she stumbles and trips and proves that some people simply don't belong in civilized society, I want her to apologize to every single person in this room." Grace stood slowly, her movements fluid despite the tremor in her hands. She looked around the ballroom, at the faces hungry for her humiliation, at Eleanor's stricken expression, at Dr. Cole's growing recognition, at her daughter's face pressed against the kitchen window. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush, "are you making this proposition officially in front of all these witnesses?" Something in her tone, a quality Richard couldn't identify but instinctively feared, made the laughter die in his throat. Grace Washington bent slowly and removed her worn black work shoes, her movements deliberate and precise. The crowd watched with mixture of fascination and cruelty as she peeled off the thick cotton socks that protected her feet during 14-hour shifts. When she straightened, barefoot on the cold marble floor, something fundamental had changed in her bearing. Her spine aligned with unconscious perfection, her arms found their natural positions, and her feet, scarred from years of point work and softened by countless hours of service, remembered their true purpose. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of trained movement. Eleanor Vanderburg felt her breath catch in her throat as recognition dawned like sunrise after a long, dark night. She'd seen this metamorphosis before, in studios and theaters across 3 decades of patronizing the arts, the moment a dancer shed their civilian skin and became something larger than human limitation. "My God," Eleanor whispered, her diamond-encrusted fingers clutching her pearl necklace. "She's not just pretending. She actually knows what she's doing." Dr. Harrison Cole leaned forward in his wheelchair, his medical mind cataloging details others missed. The way Grace's weight shifted to the balls of her feet, the micro-adjustments in her hip alignment, the unconscious turnout of her legs. These were muscle memories carved by decades of discipline, not party tricks learned from television. "That's professional training," he murmured to his caregiver, a young nursing student named Jennifer, who'd been wondering why the rich folk were being so cruel to the help. "Those are the habits of someone who spent years perfecting their craft." Richard Sterling felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down his spine as Grace moved to the center of the dance floor. What had seemed like easy sport moments before, humiliating someone so far beneath his station that her pain would barely register, now felt different, dangerous. The predator's instinct that had served him well in business was screaming warnings he couldn't yet decipher. The opening notes of La Comparsita swelled through the ballroom's acoustic perfection, and Grace closed her eyes. In that moment of darkness, she wasn't standing on marble floors surrounded by hostile strangers. She was 26 years old again, standing in the wings of Lincoln Center, Marcus adjusting her tiara with gentle hands while whispering encouragements that made her believe she could fly. "Remember, baby," Marcus's voice echoed across the years in her memory, "when you can't dance for yourself, dance for those who believe you can still touch heaven." Grace opened her eyes and began to move. The first step was simple, a basic walking pattern that began every tango, but executed with such natural authority that conversations died mid-sentence throughout the ballroom. Her right foot traced a line across the floor with the precision of calligraphy, her left following in perfect sequence. These weren't the desperate flailings Richard had expected. These were the movements of someone who understood tango not as performance, but as conversation between body and music, between heart and rhythm. By the fourth measure, gasps began rippling through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Grace's arms rose in the classic embrace position, her imaginary partner as real to her as Marcus had been during their countless hours of practice. Her head tilted at the exact angle required by the dance's vocabulary of passion and precision, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the hostile faces surrounding her. "She's actually dancing," someone whispered, the words carrying further than intended in the growing hush. "This isn't amateur hour," another voice added, tinged with confusion that bordered on alarm. The tango is a dance that reveals truth. It cannot be faked, cannot be approximated, cannot be reduced to simple steps without losing its essential nature. As Grace moved through the traditional sequence, rock step, promenade, court, each movement announced to anyone with eyes to see that they were watching someone who had devoted their life to understanding this language of controlled passion. Richard's confident smirk began to falter as Grace executed a perfect bolio, her free leg whipping in a controlled arc that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. The crowd's laughter had died completely now, replaced by the uncomfortable stirring of people realizing they'd misjudged something fundamental about what they were witnessing. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "How does she know how to do that?" "Richard, what have you done?" Eleanor Vanderberg pulled out her smartphone with shaking fingers, her manicured nails clicking against the screen as she searched for answers. "Grace Washington," she typed, adding Atlanta and dance to narrow the results. The first search result made her gasp audibly. Atlanta Ballet Theater, principal dancer Grace Washington mourned after tragic disappearance, read the headline from a 4-year-old article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Eleanor's eyes flew down the text, absorbing details that transformed her understanding of everything she was witnessing. Rising star, Lincoln Center debut, husband killed in car accident, vanished from public life. The phone slipped from Eleanor's nerveless fingers, clattering against her designer purse as she stared at the woman moving with ethereal grace across the marble floor. This wasn't some server with delusions of grandeur. This was Grace Washington, the dancer she'd watched rise through the ranks of Atlanta Ballet, whose performances had moved her to tears on half a dozen occasions before the mysterious disappearance that had left the cultural community puzzled and bereft. "Oh my God," Eleanor breathed, rising from her chair with sudden urgency. "Oh my dear God, what are we doing?" Dr. Harrison Cole had reached the same realization through different channels. His memory, sharpened by decades of precise diagnosis, had finally placed the familiar quality in Grace's movements. He'd been on the board of Atlanta Ballet during Grace's meteoric rise, had voted for her promotion to principal dancer, had watched her transform from promising student to transcendent artist. "Stop!" he called out, his aged voice carrying surprising authority. "Stop this immediately!" But Grace was lost in the music now, lost in the only place where she'd ever felt truly alive. The tango demanded complete surrender, and she gave it willingly, her body telling the story of love found and lost, of dreams shattered and dignity preserved. Her movement spoke of Marcus's gentle guidance, of Zara's brave smile, of the hundreds of nights when only the memory of music had kept her from surrendering entirely to despair. The ballroom had become a cathedral of uncomfortable silence, broken only by the passionate lament of the tango and the whisper of Grace's bare feet against marble. Camera phones that had been raised to capture humiliation now recorded something entirely different, a moment of accidental artistry that none of them had been prepared to witness. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, recognition, and growing horror as the implications of what he was witnessing penetrated his consciousness. The servers around the ballroom's periphery had stopped pretending to work, their faces reflecting the same stunned recognition that was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "She's magnificent," Jennifer whispered to Dr. Cole, her young voice filled with awe. "She always was," he replied, his old eyes bright with unshed tears. "We just forgot to look for her after the tragedy took her away from us." As the music approached its climactic passage, Grace's movements intensified, her imaginary partner leading her through the most complex sequences of the dance. She performed a series of ganchos, leg hooks that required perfect balance and timing, with the fluid precision that had once earned her standing ovations from audiences who understood they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. The final notes of La Comparsita echoed through the ballroom as Grace completed her performance with a classic tango close, her body forming a perfect line of controlled tension that held for 3 heartbeats before she relaxed into stillness. She stood in the center of the dance floor, her chest rising and falling with controlled breathing, her eyes still closed as she let the last echoes of the music fade into memory. Silence stretched like a held breath through the ballroom. 400 people sat or stood in complete quiet, processing what they had just witnessed. The transformation from cruel entertainment to unexpected artistry had happened so gradually that many were still catching up with the reality of what Grace Washington had just revealed about herself. Then Eleanor Vanderburg began to clap. The sound was sharp and sudden in the silence, her diamond bracelets catching the light as her hands came together in slow, deliberate applause. Within seconds, Dr. Harrison Cole joined her, his weathered hands creating their own rhythm of appreciation. The applause spread like ripples in a pond, tentative at first, then gaining strength as more people found the courage to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. Grace opened her eyes and found herself looking directly at Richard Sterling. His face had gone pale, the confident cruelty replaced by something that might have been recognition, might have been shame. The man who had orchestrated her humiliation now faced the consequences of discovering he'd tortured someone whose artistry exceeded anything he could ever achieve or truly understand. "Well," Grace said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustic perfection of the ballroom, "I believe you mentioned something about a wedding, Mr. Sterling." The laughter that had filled the room during her humiliation was nowhere to be found now. Instead, there was only the uncomfortable shifting of people who realized they'd been complicit in something that had transformed from cruelty into revelation, from entertainment into education about the dangers of assuming they understood the full measure of another human being's worth. The silence that followed Grace's quiet challenge stretched like a taut wire through the ballroom. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if the words he'd been preparing to speak had simply evaporated. The confident predator who'd orchestrated this public humiliation now faced something he'd never encountered in his carefully controlled world. Genuine consequence for his cruelty. Eleanor Vanderburg rose from her chair with the deliberate grace of someone who'd spent 7 decades navigating Atlanta's treacherous social waters. Her diamond necklace caught the light as she moved toward the center of the dance floor, her designer heels clicking against the marble with the authority of old money and older wisdom. "Richard Sterling," she said, her cultured Southern accent carrying easily through the acoustic perfection of the ballroom, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" Richard's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Eleanor, this is none of your concern. It's a private matter between me and my employee." "Your employee?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "Richard, you absolute fool. This is Grace Washington." She gestured toward Grace, who stood quietly in the center of the dance floor, still barefoot, still carrying herself with that unconscious elegance that marked her as something far more than what her uniform suggested. The name rippled through the crowd like electricity. Phones emerged more boldly now, no longer hiding their intent to capture whatever revelation was unfolding. People began searching, their screens lighting up with articles and images that painted a picture Richard was only beginning to comprehend. "Grace Washington," Dr. Harrison Cole announced from his wheelchair, his aged voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "was the principal dancer of the Atlanta Ballet Theater. I was on the board when we promoted her. I watched her perform at Lincoln Center." His weathered hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests until his knuckles went white. "She was magnificent." The crowd's murmur grew louder as recognition spread like wildfire. These were Atlanta's cultural elite, people who attended ballet galas, who donated to arts organizations, who prided themselves on their sophisticated taste. Grace Washington hadn't been just any dancer. She'd been their dancer, their rising star, their claim to cultural relevance on the national stage. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. The woman standing before him moved with a quality that money couldn't buy and breeding couldn't teach, the fluid authority of someone who'd spent decades perfecting their craft. Grace spoke quietly, her words cutting through the growing chaos with surgical precision. 4 years ago, I was principal dancer with Atlanta Ballet Theater. I performed at Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, and venues across Europe. I was married to Marcus Washington, first chair saxophone with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. We had a daughter named Zara. Her voice remained steady, but those who knew how to listen could hear the careful control that kept grief from overwhelming her words. On March 15, 2019, Marcus was driving us home from a performance in Savannah when a drunk driver ran a red light. Marcus died on impact. Zara spent 2 months in the hospital. I sustained injuries that ended my dancing career. The ballroom had fallen into the kind of silence usually reserved for churches and graveyards. 400 people hung on her words, many already connecting the dots that painted a picture of tragedy so complete it defied comprehension. "For the past 3 years," Grace continued, "I've worked the night shift at this hotel to pay for my daughter's medical expenses and to maintain the insurance that covers her ongoing physical therapy. Every plate I've cleared, every glass I've refilled, every humiliation I've swallowed has been for her." Richard's face had gone ashen. The cruel entertainment he'd orchestrated was transforming into something that would define his reputation for years to come. Around the ballroom, phones captured every word, every expression, every moment of his growing horror as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. "But there's more you should know," Grace said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. The doctors tell me I have perhaps 8 months left, maybe less. Every shift I work, every indignity I endure is time stolen from the time I have left with my daughter. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible across the ballroom. Several women in the crowd gasped audibly, their hands flying to their throats in unconscious sympathy. The cruelty of Richard's performance, humiliating a dying woman in front of 400 strangers, suddenly took on dimensions that moved far beyond simple bad behavior into territory that bordered on the monstrous. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "He just mocked a woman with cancer." "A dying mother," someone else added, their voice thick with disgust. Richard looked around the ballroom desperately, seeking support that was nowhere to be found. The crowd that had laughed at Grace's expense minutes before now stared at him with expressions ranging from horror to outright revulsion. His carefully constructed image as a philanthropist and community leader was crumbling in real time, broadcast live on dozens of social media platforms. I didn't know," he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. "You didn't know," Grace repeated, her voice carrying a weight that made grown adults step back. "Because in 3 years, you never once asked my name. You never wondered about my life, my dreams, my struggles. To you, I was invisible until I became inconvenient." Dr. Harrison Cole's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Richard, in my 84 years on this earth, I have witnessed lynchings, cross-burnings, and every form of cruelty one human being can inflict on another. But I have rarely seen anything as coldly calculated as what you've done tonight. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. Richard's foundation, his business empire, his carefully curated reputation, all of it balanced on the edge of complete destruction. "Wait," Richard said desperately, raising his hands as if he could physically stop the collapse of his world. "This is all a misunderstanding. I made a mistake, yes, but nothing." Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades moving in these circles. "You humiliated a dying woman. You mocked someone whose artistry brought joy to thousands. You turned her tragedy into your entertainment." Around the ballroom, conversations began in earnest as people processed what they'd witnessed. The servers who'd watched Grace's humiliation in terrified silence now looked at her with something approaching awe. The wealthy patrons who'd laughed at her expense now faced the uncomfortable reality of their complicity in something genuinely evil. Grace stood in the center of it all, still barefoot on the marble floor, watching Richard Sterling confront the consequences of his cruelty with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout 3 years of invisible service. She felt no satisfaction in his destruction, no joy in his panic. She felt only the tired weight of someone who'd carried too much pain for too long. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, and the ballroom fell silent again to hear her words. "You offered to marry me if I could dance. I danced. I showed you who I really am, not just what you chose to see." She paused, letting the implication settle like dust after an explosion. "But I don't want to marry you," she continued, her words carrying clearly in the perfect acoustics. "I want something else entirely." The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that Grace Washington, the invisible server, the dying mother, the fallen artist, was about to extract a price that would dwarf any financial settlement Richard might offer. "I want you to see me," she said simply. "Not as a server, not as a mistake, not as someone beneath your notice. I want you to see me as a human being who deserves the same basic dignity you'd expect for yourself." The simplicity of the request somehow made it more devastating than any demand for money or revenge could have been. Around the ballroom, 400 people confronted their own complicity in a system that had allowed Grace Washington to remain invisible until her pain became their entertainment. Richard stood motionless, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume, his confident demeanor replaced by something that might have been the first genuine emotion he'd shown all evening, shame so profound it threatened to buckle his knees. In the kitchen doorway, Zara Washington pressed her small face against the circular window, watching her mother stand tall in the center of a room full of people who finally saw her as she truly was. The weight of Grace's simple request, to be seen as human, settled over the ballroom like a shroud. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Richard Sterling stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his mistake and the impossibility of undoing it. Around him, 400 phones captured every twitch of his facial muscles, every bead of sweat forming on his forehead, every moment of his public reckoning with consequences he'd never imagined possible. Then his survival instincts kicked in with the brutal efficiency that had built his empire. Richard's face hardened, the vulnerability disappearing behind a mask of defensive anger that transformed Grace's moment of quiet dignity into something he could attack. "This is ridiculous," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to bending reality to his will. "I'm supposed to believe that some server who's been invisible for 3 years is suddenly a world-class dancer? That this whole thing isn't some elaborate con designed to embarrass me and extract money?" The accusation hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd expected many things from this moment, continued cruelty perhaps, or grudging acknowledgement, but not the complete denial of everything she'd just revealed about herself. "Con?" Grace repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard sensed weakness and pressed his advantage with the ruthless precision of a predator. "Oh, please. The tragic backstory, the dead husband, the sick child, the cancer diagnosis, it's all very convenient, isn't it? Very designed to generate sympathy." He gestured broadly to the crowd, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing a masterclass in manipulation." Dr. Harrison Cole's voice cut through Richard's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. "Richard, I was there when she danced Giselle at Lincoln Center. I watched her receive a 10-minute standing ovation from critics who'd come prepared to dismiss her as a regional talent." "So you say," Richard shot back, desperation making him reckless. "But where's the proof? Where are the programs, the reviews, the evidence that any of this is real?" Eleanor Vanderberg held up her smartphone, the screen displaying a high-resolution image of Grace in full costume as the Swan Queen, her arms extended in perfect alignment, her face radiant with the kind of joy that couldn't be faked. The photo's timestamp showed March 2019, just days before the accident that had destroyed everything. "Here's your proof," Eleanor said quietly. Richard barely glanced at the screen. "Photos can be doctored. Stories can be fabricated. I'm supposed to destroy my reputation based on the word of someone who's been lying to me for 3 years?" The accusation of lying struck Grace with devastating precision. She'd spent 3 years in invisible service, never claiming to be anything other than what her uniform suggested, never asking for special treatment or consideration. But somehow, in Richard's twisted logic, her survival had become deception. "I never lied to you," Grace said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "You never asked. You never cared enough to wonder who I might be beyond what you needed me to do." "Exactly!" Richard seized on her words like a weapon. 3 years of deception by omission. 3 years of playing the victim while hiding your real identity. How do I know this whole thing wasn't planned? How do I know you didn't spill that champagne deliberately to create this exact situation? The suggestion was so outrageous that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Even Richard's most loyal business associates began edging away from him, recognizing the self-destructive trajectory of his defense. Grace felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, which had been shattered years ago by Marcus's death, but something deeper. Her faith in the possibility that cruelty could be met with dignity, that suffering could be transformed into grace, that human beings could recognize their shared humanity even across vast divides of wealth and privilege. "You think," she said slowly, her voice trembling with exhaustion rather than anger, "that I gave myself cancer as part of some elaborate scheme to embarrass you?" "I think," Richard replied with cold calculation, "that people will say anything for money. And I think this whole performance was designed to extract as much as possible from me and my foundation." Grace swayed slightly on her feet. The combination of chemotherapy, emotional devastation, and sheer physical exhaustion finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. The marble floor seemed to tilt beneath her, and she reached out instinctively to steady herself against air that offered no support. Eleanor Vanderberg moved faster than her 78 years should have allowed, catching Grace's elbow just as her knees began to buckle. "Child, sit down," Eleanor whispered urgently. "You don't have to endure any more of this." But Grace straightened with visible effort, drawing on reserves of strength that shouldn't have existed after everything she'd been through. When she looked at Richard again, her eyes held something that made him step back involuntarily. Not anger or hurt, but pity so profound it seemed to strip away his armor of wealth and privilege. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully because it may be the most important thing anyone ever says to you." The ballroom fell silent again. everyone sensing that they were about to witness something that would define not just this evening, but their understanding of human nature itself. "I am dying," Grace continued, each word carefully measured and deliberately chosen. "In approximately 6 months, maybe less, my daughter will watch me slip away, just like she watched her father die. She will be alone in this world, except for whatever kindness strangers choose to show her." Richard's face had gone pale, but he stood his ground, trapped by his own rhetoric and the presence of 400 witnesses. "Every night for 3 years I have cleaned the toilets you and your guests use. I have scrubbed the floors you walk on. I have made invisible the messes you create. I have done this work, honest work, to pay for my daughter's medical care and to maintain the insurance that covers her ongoing therapy." Grace's voice grew stronger as she spoke, drawing power from the simple act of speaking truth in a room full of people who'd spent the evening consuming lies wrapped in luxury. "I have never asked you for charity. I have never complained about my circumstances. I have never failed to show up for work, never failed to complete my duties, never asked for anything beyond the wage we agreed upon. And in return, you have treated me as less than human for the crime of being poor, of being black, of being vulnerable in a world that mistakes cruelty for strength." Around the ballroom, phones continued recording, capturing every word for a world that would soon judge not just Richard Sterling, but everyone who had participated in Grace's humiliation through their laughter, their silence, or their complicity. "So, when you accuse me of manipulation," Grace concluded, "when you suggest that my pain is performance and my tragedy is theater, you reveal something about yourself that no amount of wealth can disguise. You reveal that you are exactly the kind of person who would rather believe that suffering is fraud than admit that you have spent years inflicting unnecessary cruelty on someone who deserved your basic human decency." The silence that followed was absolute. 400 people sat frozen, processing an indictment that extended far beyond Richard Sterling to encompass their entire social structure, their assumptions about worth and merit, their comfortable beliefs about poverty and privilege. Grace swayed again, and this time Eleanor's supporting arm wasn't enough. Dr. Harrison Cole gestured urgently to his caregiver, who appeared at Grace's other side with professional efficiency. Together, they eased her into a chair that someone had quickly brought forward. "Call 911, Doctor," Cole commanded, his medical training overriding social protocol. "She needs medical attention immediately." As sirens began wailing in the distance, Richard Sterling stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 400 people who now saw him exactly as clearly as Grace had demanded they see her, as a human being whose actions revealed the true content of his character. The tragedy wasn't just Grace's cancer or her poverty or her years of invisible suffering. The tragedy was that it had taken her near collapse to force a room full of allegedly civilized people to confront the cost of their indifference to the pain of others. The ambulance's red and blue lights painted the Peachtree Plaza Hotel's elegant facade in harsh, alternating colors as paramedics wheeled Grace Washington through the lobby on a stretcher. Eleanor Vanderberg followed close behind, her designer heels clicking against marble with the determined rhythm of someone who'd made a decision that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. Behind them, the ballroom remained in chaos, 400 guests processing the evening's revelations, while social media exploded with videos that would define Richard Sterling's legacy in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. At Grady Memorial Hospital, Dr. Patricia Hawkins took one look at Grace's medical bracelet and the oncology treatment schedule clutched in Eleanor's trembling hands and immediately understood the situation's gravity. Grace's blood pressure had plummeted, her body finally succumbing to months of pushing beyond reasonable limits while fighting both cancer and poverty with equal determination. "She's severely dehydrated," Dr. Hawkins explained to Eleanor as they watched Grace receive IV fluids in the emergency room. The chemotherapy, combined with the physical and emotional stress of tonight, essentially shut down her system's ability to cope. Eleanor sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Grace's bed, still wearing her diamond necklace and evening gown, looking absurdly out of place in the sterile hospital environment. But she refused to leave, driven by a recognition that had been building all evening. This woman represented everything Eleanor had failed to become. Every choice Eleanor had avoided making, every moment of courage Eleanor had surrendered to comfort and convention. "Where's her daughter?" Eleanor asked the social worker who'd appeared with practiced efficiency. "Zara's in the children's waiting area," came the reply. "We're trying to locate family members or guardians." "There are none," Eleanor said quietly. "Grace is alone, except for her daughter." The weight of that statement settled over the small group gathered around Grace's bedside. In a city of 5 million people, surrounded by wealth and privilege, Grace Washington faced her cancer battle in complete isolation, except for an 8-year-old child who needed her own medical care. 3 hours later, Grace opened her eyes to find Eleanor holding her hand with surprising gentleness. The older woman's makeup had long since worn away, revealing the kind of vulnerability that designer clothing and expensive jewelry existed to conceal. "Where's Zara?" Grace asked immediately, her voice hoarse but urgent. "She's safe," Eleanor assured her. "She's been drawing pictures in the waiting room and asking the nurses about your condition every 10 minutes. She's remarkable, Grace." Absolutely remarkable. Grace tried to sit up, but the IV lines and her body's weakness conspired to keep her horizontal. "I need to get back to work. If I miss too many shifts, they'll fire me, and then Zara won't have insurance." Eleanor's grip on Grace's hand tightened. "Child, you're not going back to that hotel. Not ever." "I don't understand." Eleanor pulled out her smartphone, the screen displaying a cascade of notifications from news outlets, social media platforms, and personal contacts. The videos from tonight have been viewed over 2 million times in the past 4 hours. The story is spreading across every major news network. Richard Sterling's reputation is destroyed, his foundation is facing a complete donor revolt, and his business partners are fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. Grace stared at the phone's screen, watching clips of her own humiliation and transformation play out in endless loops. The woman dancing barefoot on marble seemed like someone else entirely, someone braver, someone stronger, someone who hadn't spent 3 years disappearing into uniform-induced invisibility. "But that doesn't change my situation," Grace said quietly. "I still have cancer. I still have bills. I still need work." "No," Eleanor said firmly, "you don't." Before Grace could protest, Eleanor launched into an explanation that would have sounded like fantasy if not for the absolute conviction in her voice. The Vanderburg Foundation, Eleanor's personal charitable organization, would immediately establish the Grace Washington Fund, providing full medical coverage for both Grace and Zara, educational support for Zara through college, and housing that didn't require Grace to work herself to death during her remaining time. "Why?" Grace asked, the question carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to distrust unexpected kindness. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond the hospital room's sterile walls. "When I was 22, I was accepted to study dance in Paris. Full scholarship, chance of a lifetime, everything I'd dreamed of since I was a little girl." Grace waited, sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. "But my parents forbade it. Too risky," they said. "Too unconventional. I should marry well instead, secure my future through someone else's success rather than pursuing my own." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of 56 years of regret. "So I did. I married Charles Vanderburg, inherited his money when he died, and spent 4 decades living in a museum to choices I never made." Eleanor turned to face Grace directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tonight, watching you dance, I saw the woman I could have been if I'd had your courage. And watching Richard destroy you, I saw exactly what my cowardice has cost. Not just me, but everyone I could have helped if I'd chosen bravery over safety." The confession hung between them like a bridge across 50 years of missed opportunities and different choices. Grace understood, with the clarity that comes from facing one's own mortality, that Eleanor's offer represented more than charity. It was an attempt at redemption that might save them both. "There's something else," Eleanor continued, pulling out a legal document that had been hastily prepared by her attorneys. "I want to formally adopt Zara, with your permission. When your time comes, she'll have a family. She'll have the kind of opportunities that should be every child's birthright." Grace stared at the papers, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. "You don't know us? You don't know if we're worthy of this kind of investment." "Worthy?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "Grace, you worked yourself nearly to death to provide for your daughter. You maintained your dignity through 3 years of systematic humiliation. You found the strength to reveal your truth when it would have been safer to stay invisible. If you're not worthy of kindness, then worthiness doesn't exist." Through the hospital room's window, Atlanta's skyline glittered with promise and possibility. In boardrooms and bedrooms across the city, conversations were taking place that would reshape Richard Sterling's empire, redistribute power in ways that reflected the evening's harsh lessons about the cost of treating human beings as disposable. But none of that mattered as much as the moment when Grace Washington, former prima ballerina and current miracle of survival, squeezed Eleanor Vanderburg's hand and whispered, "Yes." The word carried the weight of trust earned through shared recognition of what it meant to be a woman in a world that demanded constant proof of worthiness. It carried hope that Zara would grow up in a world slightly more just than the one that had tried to erase her mother. It carried the possibility that even the deepest tragedies could be transformed into unexpected grace. In the children's waiting area, Zara Washington looked up from her drawing, a picture of her mother dancing with angels, and somehow knew that everything was about to change. The little girl who'd spent her short life watching her mother carry impossible burdens with quiet dignity was about to discover what happened when the right person finally noticed that some loads were too heavy for anyone to bear alone. The redemption that began that night in an Atlanta ballroom would ripple outward in ways none of them could imagine, touching lives and changing destinies with the persistence of water wearing away stone. But it started with 2 women, one dying, one already half dead from unlived dreams, choosing to see each other as fully human in a world that had taught them both to settle for far less than they deserved. 18 months after the night that changed everything, Grace Washington stood in the sunlit studio of the newly opened Grace Washington Center for the Arts, watching 12 children of various ages and backgrounds move through their first tango lesson. The converted warehouse in Atlanta's 4th Ward buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from dreams being realized in real time. Not just Grace's dreams, but the collective dreams of a community that had finally found a place where art transcended economic barriers. The chemotherapy had worked better than anyone had dared hope, Dr. Hawkins described Grace's response as remarkable, though Grace preferred Eleanor's more practical assessment. Sometimes the body responds to hope the way plants respond to sunlight. Grace's hair had grown back thicker than before. Her strength had returned gradually, and while she would never again possess the physical capabilities of her prime dancing years, she had discovered something more valuable: the ability to pass her knowledge to the next generation. "Miss Grace," called out 10-year-old Marcus Thompson, named after Grace's late husband and one of life's beautiful coincidences, "I can't get my feet to do what my brain wants them to do. Grace smiled, moving across the polished wood floor with the careful grace of someone who had learned to work within new limitations. That's because your brain is thinking too hard, sweetheart. In Tango, we think with our hearts first, and then our feet follow. She demonstrated a basic step, her movement still elegant despite the slight stiffness that remained from her hip injury. The children watched with the focused attention that Grace had learned to recognize as the moment when teaching became magic, when knowledge passed from one generation to another like a flame lighting a candle. Zara Washington Vanderberg sat in the corner of the studio, her leg braces now barely noticeable as she worked on homework that would have challenged high school students. At nearly 10 years old, she had grown into the kind of child who asked questions that made adults reconsider their assumptions about the world. Her adoption by Eleanor had been finalized 6 months earlier, creating a family structure that would have seemed impossible before tragedy and grace conspired to bring 3 generations of women together under one roof. "Mama Grace," Zara called out, using the name that honored both her birth mother and her adopted grandmother. "Mrs. Eleanor wants to know if you're ready for the 5 o'clock appointment." Grace nodded, dismissing her students with the kind of warmth that made each child feel individually valued. As they gathered their belongings and headed home to families who were still adjusting to the reality that their children now had access to world-class arts education regardless of their ability to pay, Grace felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that serves something larger than personal ambition. The 5 o'clock appointment was with Richard Sterling. Over the past 18 months, Richard's public destruction had been thorough and complete. The Sterling Foundation had dissolved amid donor revolts and board resignations. His real estate empire had crumbled as business partners distanced themselves from the toxicity of his brand. The videos from that December night had become case studies in business schools across the country, examples of how personal cruelty could destroy professional empires in the space of a single evening. But Eleanor, with her lifetime of understanding Atlanta's complex social dynamics, had suggested something that initially seemed impossible to Grace: redemption through service. Not the performative charity that wealthy people used to purchase social forgiveness, but genuine, sustained commitment to repairing the damage his worldview had inflicted on others. Richard entered the studio looking like a different man than the confident predator who had orchestrated Grace's humiliation. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple clothing appropriate for manual labor. His manicured hands showed calluses from months of construction work. His face carried lines that spoke of sleepless nights spent confronting the reality of who he had been and who he might still become. "Grace?" he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority that had once filled ballrooms. "Thank you for seeing me." "Have a seat," Grace replied, gesturing toward the simple chairs Eleanor had insisted on. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make anyone feel out of place. "Eleanor says you've been working on the new housing project in Mechanicsville." Richard nodded, his hands folded in his lap like a penitent child. Habitat for humanity, building homes for families who... He paused, the irony not lost on either of them. For families who work multiple jobs but still can't afford decent housing because people like me have made it impossible. For months, Richard had been volunteering with organizations that served the communities he'd spent his career exploiting. The work was anonymous, unpaid, and designed not to rehabilitate his public image, but to force him to understand the human cost of the systems he'd helped create. "Why?" Grace asked, the question she'd been holding since Eleanor first suggested this meeting. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dance floor where Grace had been teaching children to find joy in movement. "Because I need to understand what I destroyed. Not just your dignity that night, but all the dignity I've destroyed over the years by treating people as obstacles to my profit, rather than as human beings deserving of respect." He looked up, meeting Grace's eyes with the kind of direct honesty that would have been impossible during his years of wealth-insulated arrogance. "I've been working with families who lost their homes to predatory lending practices, families who worked multiple jobs but still couldn't make payments when the interest rates ballooned beyond what they'd been promised. I realized that my business model was essentially legal theft dressed up in contracts." Grace studied his face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation. What she found instead was something she recognized from her own journey through loss and reconstruction, the exhausted humility that comes from having your fundamental assumptions about the world proven catastrophically wrong. "The families you've been helping," Grace said carefully, "do they know who you are?" Richard's smile was bitter as medicine. "Some do. Most don't care as long as the work gets done. There's something liberating about being judged solely on whether you can swing a hammer straight and show up on time." Through the studio's windows, Atlanta's skyline caught the late afternoon light, transformed by ongoing development that pushed longtime residents further from the city center in pursuit of profit margins that never seemed sufficient for people like Richard had been. "Eleanor thinks you want something from me," Grace said. "I do." Richard's admission was immediate and direct. "I want to fund this center permanently. Not as a tax write-off or a publicity stunt, but because children learning to dance might grow up with a different understanding of human worth than I did." Grace had expected this offer, had discussed with Eleanor the complex ethics of accepting money from someone whose cruelty had nearly destroyed them. But seeing Richard now, not the predator from the ballroom, but a man genuinely attempting to rebuild himself from the foundation up, she understood that redemption was always a collaborative process. "There would be conditions," Grace said. "Name them." "You continue the housing work. You meet monthly with families affected by predatory lending practices. You listen to their stories without trying to fix anything or offer solutions. You just listen." Richard nodded immediately. "And," Grace continued, "you come here once a month to help with building maintenance. Not write checks for contractors, but actual work with your hands. The children need to see adults taking responsibility for creating beautiful spaces." "Done." Grace stood, extending her hand with the same dignity she'd maintained through her darkest moments. Richard took it, and for the first time in 18 months, she saw in his eyes something that reminded her of the possibility that people could change, that cruelty wasn't destiny, that even the deepest wounds could become sources of wisdom rather than bitterness. Outside the studio, Eleanor waited in her car with Zara, both of them pretending not to watch through the windows as two people who had wounded each other found a way to transform their shared pain into something that might prevent others from experiencing similar suffering. The Grace Washington Center for the Arts would become a model for community-based arts education, serving children whose families had been excluded from cultural opportunities by economic barriers. But its deeper legacy would be the proof that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the sustained work of seeing other people as fully human, worthy of dignity, capable of transformation. In Atlanta's Fourth Ward, where dreams had been deferred for generations, children now learned to dance with the understanding that their movements mattered, their stories deserved to be told, and their worth was not determined by the circumstances of their birth, but by the content of their character and the courage of their choices. Dear friends, as we reach the golden years of our lives, many of us carry the weight of dreams deferred, opportunities missed, and words left unspoken. Grace Washington's story reminds us that it's never too late to recognize the extraordinary in the ordinary people around us. The checkout clerk who greets us with genuine warmth, the janitor who works nights to support his family, the neighbor who quietly tends her garden while battling invisible struggles. How many Grace Washingtons have we passed by, their talents hidden beneath uniforms of necessity? Eleanor Vanderberg discovered at 78 that choosing courage over comfort could transform not just her own empty mansion of regrets, but the entire trajectory of a dying woman's legacy. In our communities, in our families, in the mirror each morning, there are second chances waiting to unfold. The question isn't whether we have time left to make a difference. It's whether we have the wisdom to see the difference we can still make. Every act of recognition, every moment of true seeing, every choice to lift up rather than overlook, creates ripples that reach far beyond our years. Discussion questions. Who in your daily life might be carrying hidden talents or struggles that deserve your recognition? What dream did you defer that still whispers to your heart? And what small step could you take toward it today? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters and could inspire someone else's second chance.